Chapter 25 of Ester Ried. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ester Ried by Pansy. Chapter 25. Sadie Surrounded. "Oh," said Sadie, with a merry toss of her brown curls, "don't waste any more precious breath over me, I beg. I'm an unfortunate case, not worth struggling for. Just let me have a few hours of peace once more. If you'll promise not to say 'meeting' again to me, I'll promise not to laugh at you once after this long drawn out spasm of goodness has quieted, and you have each descended to your usual level once more." "Sadie," said Ester, in a low, shocked tone, "do you think we are all hypocrites, and mean not a bit of this?" "By no means, my dear sister of charity; at least not all of you. I am a firm believer in diseases of all sorts. This is one of the violent kind of highly contagious diseases. They must run their course, you know. I have not lived in the house with two learned physicians all this time without learning that fact, but I consider this very nearly at its height, and live in hourly expectation of the turn. But, my dear, I don't think you need worry about me in the least. I don't believe I'm a fit subject for such trouble. You know I never took a whooping cough nor measles, though I have been exposed a great many times." To this Ester only replied by a low, tremulous, "Don't, Sadie, please." Sadie turned a pair of mirthful eyes upon her for a moment, and noting with wonder the pale, anxious face and quivering lip of her sister, seemed suddenly sobered. "Ester," she said quietly, "I don't think you are playing good. I don't, positively. I believe you are thoroughly in earnest. But I think you have been through some very severe scenes of late, sickness and watching, and death, and your nerves are completely unstrung. I don't wonder at your state of feeling, but you will get over it in a little while, and be yourself again." "Oh," said Ester tremulously, "I pray God I may never be myself again, not the old self that you mean." "You will," Sadie answered, with roguish positiveness. "Things will go crosswise, the fire won't burn, and the kettle won't boil, and the milk pitcher will tip over, and all kinds of mischievous things will go on happening after a little bit, just as usual, and you will feel like having a general smash up of everything in spite of all these meetings." Ester sighed heavily. The old difficulty again; things would not be undone. The weeds which she had been carelessly sowing during all these past years had taken deep root, and would not give place. After a moment's silence she spoke again. "Sadie, answer me just one question. What do you think of Dr. Douglass?" Sadie's face darkened ominously. "Never mind what I think of him," she answered in short, sharp tones, and abruptly left the room. What she did think of him was this: that he had become that which he had affected to consider the most despicable thing on earth, a hypocrite. Remember, she had no personal knowledge of the power of the Spirit of God over a human soul. She had no conception of how so mighty a change could be wrought in the space of a few hours, so her only solution of the mystery was that to serve some end which he had in view, Dr. Douglass had chosen to assume a new character. Later, on that same day, Sadie encountered Dr. Douglass, rather, she went to the side piazza equipped for a walk, and he came eagerly from the west end to speak with her. "Miss Sadie, I have been watching you. I have a few words that are burning to be said." "Proceed," said Sadie, standing with demurely folded hands, and a mock gravity in her roguish eyes. "I want to do justice at this late day to Dr. Van Anden. I misjudged him, wronged him, perhaps prejudiced you against him. I want to undo my work." "Some things can be done more easily than they can be undone," was Sadie's grave and dignified reply. "You certainly have done your best to prejudice me against Dr. Van Anden not only, but against all other persons who hold his peculiar views, and you have succeeded splendidly. I congratulate you." That look of absolute pain which she had seen once or twice on this man's face, swept over it now as he answered her. "I know. I have been blind and stupid, wicked, anything you will. Most bitterly do I regret it now. Most eager am I to make reparation." Sadie's only answer was: "What a capital actor you would make, Dr. Douglass! Are you sure you have not mistaken your vocation?" "I know what you think of me. This with an almost quivering lip, and a voice strangely humble, as unlike as possible to any which she had ever heard from Dr. Douglass before. "You think I am playing a part; though what my motive could be, I cannot imagine, can you? But I do solemnly assure you that if ever I was sincere in anything at all in my life, I am now concerning this matter." "There is a most unfortunate 'if' in the way, Doctor. You see, the trouble is, I have very serious doubts as to whether you ever were sincere in anything in your life. As to motives, a first class anybody likes to try his power. You will observe that I have a very poor opinion of the world." The Doctor did not notice the quotation of his favorite expression, but answered with a touch of his accustomed dignity: "I have deserved this treatment at your hands, Miss Sadie. Doubtless I have, although I am not conscious of ever having said to you anything which I did not think I meant. I have been a fool. I am willing, yes, and anxious, to own it. But there are surely some among your acquaintances whom you can trust if you cannot me. Sadie interrupted him. "For instance, that first class fanatic of the most objectionable stamp, the man who Dr. Douglass thought, not 3 days ago, ought to be bound by law to keep the peace. I suppose you would have me unhesitatingly receive every word he says?" Dr. Douglass's face brightened instantly, and he spoke eagerly. "I remember those words, Miss Sadie, and just how honestly I spoke them, and just how bitterly I felt when I spoke them, and I have no more sure proof that this thing is of God than I have in noting the wonderful change which has come over my feelings in regard to that blessed man. I pray God that he may be permitted to speak to your soul with the tremendous power which he has to mine. Oh, Sadie, I have led you astray. May I not help you back?" "I am not a weather vane, Dr. Douglass, to be whirled about by every wind of expediency. Besides, I am familiar with one verse in the Bible, of which you seem never to have heard: 'Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap.' You have sowed well and faithfully. Be content with your harvest." I do not know what the pale, grave lips would have answered to this mocking spirit, for at that moment Dr. Van Anden and the black ponies whizzed around the corner, and halted before the gate. "Sadie," said the Doctor, "are you in the mood for a ride? I have 5 miles to drive." "Dr. Van Anden," answered Sadie promptly, "the last time you and I took a ride together we quarreled." "Precisely," said the Doctor, bowing low. "Let us take another now, and make up." "Very well," was the gleeful answer which he received, and in another minute they were off. For the first mile or two he kept a tight rein, and let the ponies skim over the ground in the liveliest fashion, during which time very little talking was done. After that he slackened his speed, and leaning back in the carriage addressed himself to Sadie. "Now we are ready to make up." "How shall we commence?" asked Sadie, gravely. "Who quarreled?" answered the Doctor, sententiously. "Well," said Sadie, "I understand what you are waiting for. You think I was very rude and unladylike in my replies to you during that last interesting ride we took. You think I jumped at unwarrantable conclusions, and used some unnecessarily sharp words. I think so myself, and if it will be of any service to you to know it, I don't mind telling you in the least." "That is a very excellent beginning," answered the Doctor, heartily. "I think we shall have no difficulty in getting the matter all settled. Now, for my part, it won't sound as well as yours, because however blunderingly I may have said what I did, I said it honestly, in good faith, and with a good and pure motive. But I am glad to be able to say in equal honesty, that I believe I was over cautious, that Dr. Douglass was never so little worthy of regard as I supposed him to be, and that nothing could have more rejoiced my heart than the noble stand which he has so recently taken. Indeed, his conduct has been so noble that I feel honored by his acquaintance." He was interrupted by a mischievous laugh. "A mutual admiration society," said Sadie, in her most mocking tone. "Did you and Dr. Douglass have a private rehearsal? You interrupted him in a similar rhapsody over your perfections." Instead of seeming annoyed, Dr. Van Anden's face glowed with pleasure. "Did he explain to you our misunderstanding?" he asked eagerly. "That was very noble of him." "Of course! He is the soul of nobility. A villain yesterday and a saint to day. I don't understand such marvelously rapid changes, Doctor." "I know you don't," the Doctor answered quietly. "Although you have exaggerated both terms, Yet there is a great and marvelous change, which must be experienced to be understood. Will you never seek it for yourself, Sadie?" "I presume I never shall, as I very much doubt the existence of any such phenomenon." The doctor appeared neither shocked nor surprised, but favored her with a cool and quiet reply. "Oh, no, you don't doubt it in the least. Don't try to make yourself out that foolish and unreasonable creature, an unbeliever in what is as clear to a thinking mind as is the sun at noonday. You and I have no need to enter into an argument concerning this matter. You have seen some unwise and inconsistent acts in many who are called by the name of Christian. You imagine that they have staggered your belief in the verity of the thing itself. Yet it is not so. You had a dear father who lived and died in the faith, and you no more doubt the fact that he is in heaven today, brought there by the power of the Savior in whom he trusted, than you doubt your own existence at this moment." Sadie sat silenced and grave. She was very rarely either, perhaps. Dr. Van Anden was the one person who could have thus subdued her, but in her inmost heart she felt his words to be true. That dear, dear father, whose weary suffering life had been one long evidence to the truth of the religion which he professed, yes, it was so, she no more doubted that he was at this moment in that blessed heaven toward which his hopes had so constantly tended, than she doubted the shining of that day's sun. So he, being dead, yet spoke to her. Besides, her keen judgment had, of late, settled back upon the belief that Dr. Van Anden lived a life that would bear watching, a true, earnest, manly life, also that he was a man not likely to be deceived. So, sitting back there in the carriage, and appearing to look at nothing, and be interested in nothing, she allowed herself to take in again the firm conviction that whatever most lives were, there was always that father, safe, safe in the Christian's heaven; and there were besides some few, a very few, she thought, but there were some still living whom she knew, yes, actually knew, were fitting for that same far away, safe place. No, Sadie had stood upon the brink, was standing there still, indeed; but reason and the long buried father still kept her from toppling over into the chasm of settled unbelief. "Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth, yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them." But something must be said. Sadie was not going to sit there and allow Dr. Van Anden to imagine that she was utterly quieted and conquered. She would rather quarrel with him than have that. He had espoused Dr. Douglas's cause so emphatically, let him argue for him now. There was nothing like a good sharp argument to destroy the effect of unpleasant personal questions, so she blazed into sudden indignation. "I think Dr. Douglas is a hypocrite." Nothing could have been more composed than the tone in which she was answered, "Very well, what then?" This question was difficult to answer, and Sadie remaining silent, her companion continued: "Mr. Smith is a drunkard, therefore I will be a thief. Is that Miss Sadie Ried's logic?" "I don't see the point." "Don't you? Wasn't that exclamation concerning Dr. Douglas a bit of hiding behind the supposed sin of another, a sort of a reason why you were not a Christian, because somebody else pretended to be? Is that sound logic, Sadie? When your next neighbor in class peeps in her book, and thereby disgraces herself and becomes a hypocrite, do you straightway declare that you will study no more? You see, it is fashionable, in talking of this matter of religion, to drag out the shortcomings and inconsistencies of others, and try to make of them a garment to covet our own sins; but it is very senseless after all, and you will observe is never done in the discussion of any other question." Clearly, Sadie must talk in a common sense way with this straightforward man, if she talked at all. Her resolution was suddenly taken, to say for once just what she meant, and a very grave and thoughtful pair of eyes were raised to meet the doctor's when next she spoke. "I think of these things sometimes, doctor, and though a great deal of it seems to be humbug, it is as you say. I know some are sincere, and I know there is a right way. I have been more than half tempted many times during the last few weeks to discover for myself the secret of power, but I am deterred by certain considerations, which you would, doubtless, think very absurd, but which, joined with the inspiration which I receive from the ridiculous inconsistencies of others, have been sufficient to deter me hitherto." "Would you mind telling me some of the considerations?" And the moment Sadie began to talk honestly, the doctor's tones lost their half indifferent coolness, and expressed a kind and thoughtful interest. "No," she said, hesitatingly, "I don't know that I need, but you will not understand them. For instance, if I were a Christian I would have to give up one of my favorite amusements, almost a passion, you know, dancing is with me, and I am not ready to yield it." "Why should you feel obliged to do so if you were a Christian?" Sadie gave him the benefit of a very searching look. "Don't you think I would be?" she queried, after a moment's silence. "I haven't said what I thought on the subject, but I feel sure that it is not the question for you to decide at present. First settle the all important one of your personal acceptation of Christ, and then it will be time to decide the other matter, for or against, as your conscience may dictate." "Oh, but," said Sadie, positively, "I know very well what my conscience would dictate, and I am not ready for it." "Isn't dancing an innocent amusement?" "For me, yes, but not for a Christian." "Does the Bible lay down one code of laws for you, and another for Christians?" "I think so. It says, 'Be not conformed to the world.'" "Granted. But does it anywhere say to those who are of the world, 'You have a right to do just what you like'? That direction does not apply to you at all. It is intended for those poor Christians." "Dr. Van Anden," said Sadie, with dignity, "don't you think there should be a difference between Christians and those who are not?" "Undoubtedly I do. Do you think that every person ought or ought not to be a Christian?" Sadie was silent, and a little indignant. After a moment she spoke again, this time with a touch of hauteur. "I think you understand what I mean, Doctor, though you would not admit it for the world. I don't suppose I feel very deeply on the subject, else I would not advance so trivial an excuse. But this is honestly my state of mind. Whenever I think about the matter at all, this thing comes up for consideration. I think it would be very foolish for me to argue against dancing, for I don't know much about the arguments, and care less. I know only this much, that there is a very distinctly defined inconsistency between a profession of religion and dancing, visible very generally to the eyes of those who make no profession. The other class don't seem so able to see it, but there exists very generally among us worldlings a disposition to laugh a little over dancing Christians. Whether this is a well-founded inconsistency, or only a foolish prejudice on our part, I have never taken the trouble to try to determine, and it would make little material difference which it was. It is enough for me that such is the case, and it makes it very plain to me that if I were an honest professor of that religion which leads one of its teachers to say, 'He will eat no meat while the world stands, if it makes his brother to offend,' I should be obliged to give up my dancing. But since I am not one of that class, and thus have no such influence, I can see no possible harm in my favorite amusement, and am not ready to give it up. And that is what I mean by its being innocent for me, and not innocent for professing Christians." Dr. Van Anden made no sort of reply, if Sadie could judge from his face. He seemed to have grown weary of the whole subject. He leaned back in his carriage, and let the reins fall loosely and carelessly. His next proceeding was most astounding. Coolly possessing himself of one of the small gloved hands that lay idly on Sadie's lap, he said, in a quiet, matter-of-fact tone, "Sadie, would you allow me to put my arm around you?" In an instant the indignant blood surged in waves over Sadie's face. The hand was angrily withdrawn, and the graceful form drawn to an erect height, and it is impossible to describe the freezing tone of astonished indignation in which she ejaculated, "Dr. Van Anden!" "Just what I expected," returned that gentleman in a composed manner, bestowing a look of entire satisfaction upon his irate companion. "And yet, Sadie, I hope you will pardon my obtuseness, but I positively cannot see why, if it is proper and courteous, and all that sort of thing, I, who am a friend of 10 years' standing, should not enjoy the same privilege which you accord to Fred Kenmore, to whom you were introduced last week, and with whom I heard you say you danced 5 times." Sadie looked confused and annoyed, but finally she laughed, for she had the good sense to see the folly of doing anything else under existing circumstances. "That is the point which puzzles me at present," continued the doctor, in a kind, grave tone. "I do not understand how young ladies of refinement can permit, under certain circumstances, and often from comparative strangers, attentions which, under other circumstances, they repel with becoming indignation. Won't you consider the apparent inconsistency a little? It is the only suggestion which I wish to offer on the question at present. When you have settled that other important matter, this thing will present itself to your clear seeing eyes in other and more startling aspects. Meantime, this is the house at which I must call. Will you hold my horses, Miss Sadie, while I dispatch matters within?" CHAPTER XXVI.